Welcome to the Underdog Sniper Podcast. I am your host, MGCovers. This is episode 33. We're going to cover a lot, and let's give you the outline of this podcast. Greatly appreciate you tuning in if you're watching this live on YouTube or if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes as well. Number one, we're going to talk about NCAA football results. Had a brutal week in NCAA football, a really solid week in NFL. We'll talk about that. The third thing we'll talk about, it's not talked about in sports handicapping, reframing into a positive. If you're a client, you've heard that term before, meaning like when there's negativity in what you're doing, you have to reframe it into a positive. I'm going to show you a real life example of how I do it. And if you're just starting out, I'll give you an example as well. And number fourth thing, we're going to talk about an unorthodox approach to handicapping. I've kind of hinted at this before, but this would be full on 100% committing to this particular way of handicapping. And I think there's some validity in it. We're also going to talk about the presidential election. I'm going to give you my prediction on the presidential election. I'm going to give you a ton of stats. I just researched this extensively last night. We'll go through that. And then finally, the sixth concept we're talking about is stop wagering if you hit your goal for that particular sport, regardless of when that is in the season. Very controversial. I'll give you some really good data that's going to back that up. I'll give you a real life example as always. All right. So let's dive into it. NCAA football. We had the worst week I think we've had probably the last 2 years. We went 0-7. Seems hard to do, but believe it or not, it's easy to do. Again, I like talking about things that actually really happen in this business. That is normal. I do believe the model has lost its edge. Had a losing weekend last week. We had some bad beats. Technically, we only had one true bad beat this week, but I do believe the model has lost its edge. I did replace it with a new model that I'm going to use going forward, and the results of this one are absolutely fascinating. If you guys remember, back early in the season, I wanted to come up with a model to use for the first 3 weeks of NFL season, NCAA season. The reason is that I need 3 weeks of data for my model to work, right? So I came up with this, what I call a subjective model, meaning it doesn't technically use stats. So it's a subjective model. And in doing so, that creates a lot of margin of victory. That actual model, I may have talked about on this podcast, it went 7-50 for the first 3 weeks of the season, 67-50. And then after those 3 weeks, and I even made a coaching video about this. I told clients, hey, you could probably use this model for the rest of the season. And here we are at week 10, and I'm actually going back to it. So was it a mistake to move to this model that I'm using now? Probably not. The reason I'm saying it, I had back tested this model that actually lost its edge. The back test netted out 15 units testing it against last year's season. So I had tested it. Granted, it was only one season, but I still felt better about that. And this particular approach, the one that went 67-50, I didn't want to commit to it simply because it was, quote, a subjective model. And then, of course, there's variance, but those are pretty impressive numbers at 67-50. Now, we'll say this. I've gone back to this model, and what I did was, I'll share this with clients. I don't know if I can share it on the podcast, but instead of making it subjective, I figured out a way to make it, quote, objective, so that there's no guessing, and then ran the model based on that. I may do a follow-up public video and show you some of the results. So I'm excited about NCAA football, and that kind of leads me into reframing it into a positive. Because if I'd recorded this podcast on Saturday night, I would not have the same positive attitude that I have now. All right, let's talk about NFL. We had one play. We played Washington. That was a winner. Super excited about this model. This was probably, let's pull this up. This was probably the best. This was the best week this model's had. All right, so you take a look at that. We had Houston. That was a loss on Thursday night. Baltimore won and covered. Cincinnati won and covered. Washington won and covered. And Detroit won and covered. So really, really solid week. And I just posted this on Instagram. This particular model, if you've heard me talk about what I call an abstract model, there's been a paradigm shift in NFL. And back in the summer when I was doing some back testing, I thought, I think if we use these two stats, this model would act, this is a model that would work. So I sent it to one of my stat model partners, big shout out to Eric. And so he took the stats and actually the way he calculated it, I think was absolutely brilliant. He did it completely different than I would have done it. But the point to be made, if we would have ran this model and wagered this model, use this model from beginning of the season up to now, it would have gone 23-20 up 9.19 units. So what I was thinking and how to handicap football, I think this is a really solid model. So excited to see where this ends up year to date. So that's pretty solid. So what was that? So that was 4-1. So a really solid week. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is reframing sports betting when something negative happens into a positive. So for example, we went 0-7 in NCAA football. Now, what you're looking at is my betting log for the entire year. I used to use the monitoring service. I like doing it this way because sometimes when I had a monitoring service, I would be influenced, meaning if the monitoring service didn't offer that particular play, especially with soccer, I wouldn't play it. So I decided to just use Google Sheets and put all of my wagers year to date here. So anybody can check this. It's open to the public. All you have to do is to go to MGCovers.com, go over to the right and look on betting log, and you'll see this exact same thing I have here. So reframing into the positive. Well, one thing you can do, and what I do is, so let's say we went 0-7 in NCAA football. We've actually had a slow start to NHL, down a couple units there, down 1.5 units in soccer. And of course, with the NCAA football loss, that puts us at like -4 units. We're up 10 units in NCAA football. So all that is, quote, negative. One way to reframe it into the positive, and we'll go through this, is I just simply look at my year to date. So MLB, we were up 34.82 units. Starting the year out with NHL, we were up 19.25 units. I thought I had this total here. NCAA football, you can see now down four units. NBA, we had one play last night. That was our first play. That was a loss. NFL, minus 1.69 units. Soccer, minus 1.55. NHL, minus 2.43 units. But if you add all that up together, we are net at 44 point units year to date. So that's a positive. And then you sort of reinforce the things you already know about sports betting. Only, I say it's 5% of the people that wager on sports turn a profit long term. The majority of people say it's 3%. That can be debated, but nonetheless, it's very difficult to turn a profit in this business long term. I'm one of the few that can actually do that. So we're having a really solid year. So that's a way to reframe something into a positive. Now, let's talk about if you're new to sports handicapping and you don't have like any success to fall back on. And let's say hypothetically you had a Saturday where you went, let's say this past Saturday you went 0-5, and this particular Sunday, yesterday you went 0-5. So now you wake up Monday morning, you're like, man, I'm in a terrible mood. I'm extremely discouraged. I went 0-10. Now, what you could do, I'll give you two examples. The first thing you could do is you could go back, you could chalk this off as a learning experience, meaning even though you went 0-10, go back and look at your wagers. Let's say maybe if you're using a top-down approach, did you misinterpret some line movement? Maybe you thought it was sharp movement, but in reality, it was a public line move. Maybe there was an injury. The line went from -4 all the way up to -7.5. You thought that was sharp movement, but in actuality, it was a public line move. So you could treat it as a learning experience. Or maybe there was something with your model. Go back and analyze your losses. What was something you missed, looking at box scores, et cetera, et cetera. So chalk it off as a learning experience. The second thing you could do to reframe it into a positive, you could say, hey, I use good money management. And let me give an example. The way I teach, let's say your bankroll is $1,000. So I suggest wagering no more than 10% of your bankroll in one day. It doesn't matter how many plays, etc. So it's more of a dollar amount. So on Saturday, the max you wagered was 100. You had 5 plays. You wagered $20 on each. You lost $100. Then you turn around and did the same thing on Sunday. You had 5 plays. You lost all 5. You lost $100. So your bankroll was $1,000. Now it's $800. So because you used very good bankroll management, you still have majority of your bankroll. You have 80% of your bankroll still left over. And then you could adjust it. You could say, hey, I use good bankroll management. Now I'm going to adjust it, meaning your bankroll is 800. 10% of 800 is $80. So I will risk no more than $80 per day. So if you have a quote bad day like you did Saturday and Sunday, the max you're going to lose is going to be 10% of your bankroll. So that's a way to reframe into a positive. Because if you don't reframe into a positive, it affects other aspects of your life. Because if you sit around and sulk, you may end up cheating on your diet. You may end up being disrespectful to your wife. You may say something negative to your kids. And as cliche as it sounds, there's nothing positive that happens from having a negative mentality, if that makes sense, right? So it's very important once you feel that negativity. I think I talked about it in last week's episode. If you feel like you've hit tilt where you're extremely stressed, just take a day off, right? There's games every single day, a full slate of games. So you can always, another way to reframe is just take a break from sports betting. But I think it's important, whatever you're feeling negative wise, to reframe that. And another tip that I'll give you, if you're building models, like what I did with NCAA football, I made the decision, hey, this model has lost its edge. It's not as effective now as it was late in the season. So what made me more positive, I changed the model and had absolutely incredible results applying that subjective model to this particular week. It was positive. Again, I might make a video about that. So that got me excited. So it took that negativity out of me and I was, quote, positive again. So very important to do. And that's going to bring me to an interesting point. We'll talk about this. I've talked about setting a goal in sports handicapping. And what I mean by that is, like, if you remember the beginning of the fall season, I said my goal for NCAA football and NFL combined was 10 units, right? And I think we ended up hitting, I don't know if I have this on here or not. Let me pull this up. Let's see here. Let's go back to the betting log. Yep, here we go. All right, so we're at NCAA football. I think, this is important to show this. Let's take a look at, all right, I don't know if you guys can, y'all can see it on the screen. Okay, October the 19th, we were at 9.83 units. Okay, now this is unorthodox, and people think I'm crazy. Might think I'm crazy for suggesting this. But what if you set a goal? And again, this isn't that crazy because I have a client of mine named Dave. Big shout out to Dave. Also a really good handicapper. He does this with sports, and it makes a lot of sense. If you hit your goal, you shut down the season, meaning you would stop wagering. So if I set my goal as 10 units, let's just say it was 10 units. We hit 9.83 units. All right, we've hit our goal with NCAA football. We're not going to wager on NCAA football anymore. Now, the end result is we kept wagering, and look where we are now on November the 4th. We're at minus 4 units. So we ended up losing. We were in a hole from where we were then to now is minus 13 units. So hypothetically, and let me talk about why that's important to set goals. I've done this long enough, and this takes some experience. 10 units for NFL and NCAA football combined is really good. For one sport, NFL or NCAA football combined is excellent because think about this in NFL, I think you actually have like 18 weeks, right? So even if you had 18 weeks, let's say you had 12 winning weeks and 6 losing weeks, you would say, hey, that's a great season. But let's say you're averaging 1 unit per week. That's only 6 units. That's what I'm saying. You just can't make a lot of units in NCAA football and NFL. And if you're new to the podcast, one mistake you'll see handicappers or a way that they misinterpret units is I'm grading, when I talk about units, I'm grading one play as 1 unit. Like you'll see a lot of handicappers, they will inflate their units. They'll say, oh, this was an 8 unit play. This was a 10 unit play. That's basically fraudulent and misrepresenting the industry because there's no way you can correctly calculate your ROI. Because if you have one play that's up 5 units, you have another play that's 1 unit, how you can't correctly calculate your ROI. So the correct way to do it when you're grading it and comparing yourself to other people, one play is 1 unit. So if you wager minus 136 and that particular play loses, you're down minus 1.36 units. If you wager plus 150 dog and it wins, you're up 1.5 units. So again, small tangent there, but nonetheless, let's say I set the goal in NCAA football. This is a great example. If we hit our goal, we're going to stop wagering. Now that sounds ludicrous to stop wagering on NCAA football on October the 19th. But again, I've done this long enough and I've just proved to you it's very difficult to go beyond that. Meaning like you basically hit your goal. So let's say we stop wagering. We've shut down NCAA football. We're up 9.83 units. All right. Now let's go back to, let's take a look at Major League Baseball season. And I'm going to try to find out, I can't find it on here when that was, but I think around, I wonder if it was August. Let me see here. I think it was right here. Let's see if it was on August the 16th. Let me see what this is. At one point, we were at 50 units in Major League Baseball. All right, there we go. Boom. Look down there in the bottom. See where it says 51.6 units? Let me see if I can scroll back up to the top. Okay. August the 16th. And that's way late in the season. August the 16th, we were at 51 units. The most units I'd ever made was the previous Major League Baseball season. And I think it was, what was that, 44 units? And prior to that, the biggest season I ever had was with NHL. And that was like 2018 or 2019. We hit 30 units in NHL for one season. So again, in retrospect, this probably was a mistake, meaning you've outmaxed the potential of that particular sport. Like 50 units in Major League Baseball, that's insane. That's insane. Regardless of what you hear on the internet, I'm telling you, that is absolutely incredible. That's the max I've ever grossed out in a season, albeit we didn't finish at that. So let's say when I hit 40, I set another goal to get to 50. So the point is, if you're at 51 units for a season that probably a good Major League Baseball season would be like 20, right? 25, whatever. So we're at 51. There's no way to possibly think that we can actually make more than that. So in retrospect, that was a mistake. So again, going back to this premise of what if we hit our goal, we stop wagering. So August the 16th, we're at 51 units. We shut it down completely. All right. Let's add that together. Let's take our baseball units, which was 9.83 plus 51 for baseball. That's 60.83 units. So I'm going to prove to you why this is probably the best way to do this. So that's 60.83 units. We didn't stop wagering. We continue to wager. And let's add up what it actually is. 34.82 units for Major League Baseball, minus 4 for college football. 30.82 units. Listen to me, guys. That is a 30-point difference. Almost makes me sick to think about it. So as ludicrous as it sounds, if I would have adopted the concept of once you hit your goal, stop wagering, shut that sport down because you've maxed out the potential, a realistic potential of units you can actually make in that season. And if I would apply that, we would be up 30 more units than we are now. So instead of 44 units year to date, we'd be up 70 units year to date. So it's not that unorthodox, right? And I really think that I'm going to start wagering this way. In fact, I talked with Eric, the other guy that I share model information with, who's done a great job with UFC, by the way. A quick plug for UFC. We give out UFC free plays every Thursday on my Instagram. Follow me on Instagram, MGCovers, cover spelled with the Z. He's gone, I think it's 9-1, y'all, for the last free plays. Absolutely brilliant handicapper. does a great job handicapping UFC, and he's profitable long term as well, not just with the free plays. But what we're working on now is we're working on an NBA model, because I think NBA, the last year's model, we got it up to 10 units as well. And then February, March, April, it tended to fade. So the best time to make profit in any season is early on. The later in the season, more difficult. And so not that far-fetched to think this way. And I believe this is what I'm going to adopt. So for NBA, if we get NBA to 10 units, I'll shut it down. If it's December the 17th or if it's January the 19th. So not that far-fetched. And I've just proved to you there 30 extra units if I would have applied this concept. So again, understanding what realistic percentages are, realistic goals, realistic units that you can earn in the season. Once you hit that goal, shut it down, and it will allow you to focus on something else. All right. So we've covered all that. Let's dive into the presidential election. Super excited about this. Now, this is my own research. Now, I have to talk about something quick. I have to briefly explain my disposition with regards to politics, because we are a politicized society now. And what that means is people, it's hard to have an opinion without being extremely criticized in politics. All I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my prediction and analysis of the presidential election, giving you some statistics, using some objective handicapping and subjective handicapping. And let me disclose this. I am a libertarian, not a liberal, a libertarian. What a libertarian means, and I hate being labeled. A libertarian basically, in layman's terms, means do whatever you want to do, just leave me alone. So I'm in favor of less government. There's certain tendencies I lean to the left on, certain tendencies I lean to the right. For example, fiscally, I lean more towards the right side, the Republican side, the conservative side, meaning less government spending, less government interaction. Other concepts I lean to the left on. I'm in favor of universal health care. I've traveled extensively South America the last 5 years. They have it 1,000 times better. Their healthcare system, healthcare structure overseas, a lot less expensive. A lot of those countries, they don't have health insurance. You pay $100 a month to a hospital. Everything's covered. You go to a doctor, you walk into a pharmacy, tell them you got a sore throat, boom, they give you medicine. There's no, you don't go to a doctor, you don't call your insurance company, or you don't file insurance, none of that. I'm also pro-choice as well. So I'm basically a libertarian. So when I give you these views and concepts, this is not to endorse Harris. It's not to endorse Trump. It's just me looking at this from a sports handicapping perspective and what I think. And I'm going to give you some actual data to support all this. Okay. And I actually made a pretty substantial wager, and depending on whatever the outcome is, I'll share with you how much I wager, but it's a significant amount. All right. So let's take a look at this. Now, again, like anything else, you need like some statistical data. What I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you analysis of popular presidents and their percentage of votes compared to the population. I think that's a better representation of that president's popularity. Like how many people in the country at that time voted for this particular president. Obama, 2012, he got 65 million votes. There were 314 million people living in America in 2012. That's 21% of the popular vote. No, 21% of the population voted for Obama in 2012. And the reason I use 2012, he was extremely popular. I think he was probably a slight underdog in 2008, but 2012, extremely popular president, and still is to this day. Reagan, 1984, that was a landslide victory. He beat Carter in 1980. That was basically when I was a kid. 1984, he absolutely destroyed Walter Mondale. I think Mondale won maybe 4 states. I mean, it was a blowout. Reagan, extremely popular in 1984, and he was a Republican. Obama was a Democrat, if you're new to politics. Reagan got 54 million votes. The population in 1984 in America was 225 million. So that's 23% of the population voted for him. Lyndon B. Johnson, 1964, he got 43 million votes. there was 191 million people living in America. So he got 23% of the people living in America to vote for him. This is interesting to note. He won 61% of the popular vote. That was the highest number ever in America. Highest number ever. By Roosevelt, 1936, 27.7 million votes. The population in America in 1936 was 128 million. He got 21% of the vote. 21% of the people voted for him that were living in America. He won 60% of the popular vote. So the reason I use these four as, quote, the model was these were extremely popular presidents. Now, Biden is not a polarizing figure. Obama is a polarizing figure, very charismatic. Reagan, very polarizing figure, very charismatic. Roosevelt, charismatic figure, very well liked. Biden, I do not feel like is a very charismatic figure. He was basically a lifelong politician. However, he got 81 million votes in the 2020 election, which is the most ever in any presidential election. Now, granted, the population was higher. That's why I ran the model this way. The population in America in 2020 was 339 million. Guys, 24% of the people in this country voted for Biden. That was the highest it's ever been, ever. So based on this stats, Biden was more popular than Obama. Biden was more popular than Reagan. Biden was more popular than Johnson. Biden was more popular than Roosevelt. And here is where I have to bring in some subjective analysis. I believe America is a corrupt nation. And for this reason, I don't believe it's possible for Biden to have won this election fairly. All right. Now, let's go over to I can't show this one. My bad, y'all. I have to read this off. I thought I had this sheet. I can't show this sheet. I don't know how to do this. My bad. All right, but I'll still read this off to you. All right. So some further analysis of this. So basically, that was the first time a president-elect received 24% of the votes relative to the population. And some other very fascinating stats that do not make a lot of sense regarding the 2020 election. And again, I'm going to make a point about this particular election. Biden also won in Georgia in 2020. That was the first time a Democrat had won Georgia since 1992. I'm not sure that I believe that simply because of his popularity as compared to these other popular presidents. Some other interesting notes about this particular election. When you've heard the term swing states. Swing states mean they're going to have a huge impact on this election. Some swing states, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all have Democratic governors. And my prediction is Harris will win all of these states. Interesting note, Katie Hobbs is the governor of Arizona. She was the former Secretary of State. She oversees the election. That's what a Secretary of State does. And now she's already and she's the governor now. And Arizona has already stated that it's probably going to take them 2 weeks to calculate the votes. So another subjective analysis of this, that throws up a huge red flag for me. And so my overall conclusion on this, well, let's read this last part. I can't show this up here. Harris announced her candidacy on July the 21st, 2024. When she wins, and I believe she's going to win, no candidate in the history of the United States will have campaigned less than she has and won. So she's only campaigned 170 days. The only similar case was Hubert Humphrey, who announced on April 27, 1968. So he announced like 4 months earlier than she did, and he was blown out in the election. He received 31 million votes. The population at that time in 68 was 200 million. So he got 16% of the population voted for Hubert Humphrey. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you, I'm drawing parallels between Harris and Biden. I don't think Harris is as popular as Obama, Reagan, Johnson, Roosevelt. I put her very similar to Biden. And again, I'm not a conspiracy theory, but I do believe there is major corruption in our government. And what's interesting to note, Harris is an underdog, but that line has started to move in her favor. And I'm, as crazy as it may sound, I think there's a lot of people that think the way that I think. You've already heard rumors of election fraud. And yes, I know what happened in 2020. They took this to court. They didn't find any evidence. But again, another subjective part that I'm factoring in is I think America is a corrupt nation. I think our government is corrupt. Every aspect of it is. Maybe it's ludicrous to think that way, but based on research and some of that I've shared here in this particular podcast, that's why I believe that Harris is going to win this election in 2020. From a sports handicapping perspective, you can get this line for, let's see what it is. Let's take a look at it today. Let me pull this up here. If I'm not mistaken, I think she's like plus 135. And again, I'm not endorsing Trump. I'm not endorsing Harris. I'm just trying to make a good wager. All right, let's take a look. All right, looks like it's gone up slightly today in favor of Trump. Trump is minus 140 at Bovada. Best line for Harris is bookmaker at plus 140. And that's pretty much the way it is. It'd be interesting to see what happens. And of course, this poly market, people talk about this, where people actually wager real money. You can see when she announced. And that's fascinating. Maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe it looks like you have a lot more people wagering on Trump. But again, if you want to be analytical, it looks like the quote public is banking more on Trump than Harris. So this is almost in a lot of ways playing Harris is a classic, fade to public scenario. So very fascinating. But again, just to clarify, I don't want anybody to flip out and lose their mind. I'm not a Trump supporter. In fact, I'll tell you this, I'm not a Harris supporter. I'm just trying to look at this from a analytical perspective, using some real data, using some subjective analysis. That's what I predict. So again, that's my thoughts on that. In fact, I'm 55 years old. This is absolutely fascinating. I can't believe I'm going to share this. I've never voted in presidential election. I've never voted in any election and never will. I absolutely despise politics and think it's a very divisive mechanism in our culture. All right, long podcast. Greatly appreciate you guys tuning in. Hey, don't forget to like this video and look for a ton of content to come out this week. Thanks for listening and talk to you guys soon.